spring of 2007, we traveled to Turkey, stopping in New York City for a few days on the way. In New York, we stayed in a condo in Midtown Manhattan with beautiful views of the city and the Empire State Building. The last time we were in New York, 10 years ago, the World Trade Center dominated the lower Manhattan skyline. Now, Ground Zero is a large construction site. It was an emotional experience watching the workers rebuilding the devastation that happened on 9/11. We visited several old churches in the area, including Trinity Church, where Alexander Hamilton is buried. My favorite stop in New York was a museum of modern art, in a magnificent new building with room after room of Picasso, Matisse, Monet, and Van Gogh, including his famous Starry Night. The building was almost as mind-boggling as the amazing works of art. An overnight flight from New York got us to Istanbul to begin our Turkey adventure. The famous Blue Mosque, built in the early 1600s, isn't actually blue. The name comes from the famous blue tiles on the walls inside. The Blue Mosque is surrounded by a beautiful park full of tulips. On the other side of the park from the Blue Mosque is the Hagia Sophia, one of the most important and impressive buildings ever constructed. Originally built as a church in 537 AD, it was changed to a mosque in 1453 when Mehmet the Conqueror took control of Istanbul. Now the Hagia Sophia is a museum. The Hagia Sophia has gorgeous mosaics which are currently being restored. They were once plastered over by Muslims because of the Islamic belief that anything with an immortal soul cannot be depicted in art. As beautiful as the Blue Mosque and Hagia Sophia are during the day, they are even more dramatic at night. Our next stop was a huge Byzantine sunken palace cistern dating back to the 4th century. 336 columns line the walkway and support the ground above. 2 of them have really cool Medusa head bases, recycled from another building and used simply for construction material. Istanbul's famous Grand Bazaar is amazing, with lots of carpet shops, jewelry shops, clothes, and junk. The spice market, about a mile away, is full of exotic sights, smells, and sounds. The so-called New Mosque was actually completed in 1663. It is across the road from the Galata Bridge. We crossed the Galata Bridge to climb to the top of the Galata Tower for some nice views. Topkapi Palace, Istanbul's #1 tourist attraction, was home of the sultans for nearly 400 years. Mehmet the Conqueror built Topkapi on a hill overlooking the sea. The palace is vast, with several buildings surrounded by courtyards and palace grounds covered in breathtaking tulips. A highlight of the palace is the harem, which served as the private living quarters of the Sultan and his family. The marble courtyard with a view of the city below is where the huge celebrations were held when the Sultan lived in the palace. The Karen Museum is noted for its mosaics. The current building was built in the 11th century as a church, but was converted to a mosque in the 16th century when they plastered over the beautiful frescoes and mosaics. The Byzantine mosaics, now mostly restored, provide a detailed account of early Christian history. A cruise on the Bosphorus provides wonderful views of castles, mosques, impressive buildings, and people going about their daily lives. One of Istanbul's most famous streets is Istiklal Caddesi, loaded with people, vendors, cafes, and high-end shops. From Istanbul, we flew to Selçuk to learn more about the ancient cities there. The ancient Greek city of Priene, dating back to 300 BC, was built as a port city, but silt from the Meander River built up, and now it is several miles inland. Priene has Greek ruins because the invading Romans passed it by. Most of the other ancient cities we went to had Roman ruins because the Romans built over the Greek buildings. Priene was a favorite of Alexander the Great. He and his family stayed in Priene for 6 years before he died of malaria. We saw remains of lots of structures, including the ancient water system. I love the nicely preserved 5,000-seat Greek amphitheater with its special front row seats for dignitaries and an altar to sacrifice animals before the opening act. The impressive Temple of Athena, located on a hill, has been partially restored. One of the best preserved structures is the Assembly Building, or Senate House, where votes were counted after elections. It has never been restored since it was built over 2,300 years ago. People once traveled miles on the sacred marble highway to Didyma to consult the Oracle of Apollo, which was just as famous as the Oracle of Delphi in Greece. The enormous Temple of Apollo was constructed in 500 BC. The magnificent columns were made of heavy discs lifted into place by a pulley system. Once the column was erected, slaves hanging onto the ropes from the top of the columns chiseled the deep vertical grooves. What a job that must have been. The two remaining 60-foot columns have been standing there intact for 2,400 years, a miracle given the frequent earthquakes and wars that have destroyed so much of the ancient sites in this part of the world. Miletus, the next ancient city we visited, was connected to Didyma by a sacred marble highway. Miletus was a cradle of philosophy and science in the 6th century BC. Miletus was a wealthy city, even larger than Ephesus. Most of the city is now buried, destroyed by an earthquake in 1975. The best preserved structure in Miletus is a theater, built during the Hellenistic period. During the construction, the workers got upset over pay and etched graffiti into some of the seats showing the construction manager with a noose around his neck. The theater has a capacity of 24,000 people. Around 200 AD, Marcus Aurelius built the Baths of Faustina for his wife. The first heating system was used there. The baths had an elaborate system of cold and hot pools, as well as a sauna, gym, and locker room. Ephesus is the best-known ancient ruin in Turkey. It was originally a Greek city built about 1000 BC. During the Roman era, Ephesus was the main seaport on the Aegean and center of commerce for thousands of years. The Baths of Varius are at the east entrance to the city. During the Roman rule, everyone who traveled to Ephesus had to take a bath upon entering the city to get rid of bugs and cut down on disease. There was an intricate water system made up of terracotta pipes. Next to the baths at the eastern entrance was the Odeon, a small theater that was used for concerts and theater performances, as well as the meeting place for the Roman Council. The terrace houses were private residences occupied from the 3rd century BC to the 7th century AD. They had beautiful artwork on the walls, ceilings, and floors. Archaeologists were sorting through piles of fragments, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle back together. The Library of Celsius is where learned men lectured and discussed politics, philosophy, and other issues of the day. The theater at Ephesus was one of the largest in the Aegean area, holding 25,000 people. It was used for gladiator contests, animal fights, political and philosophical discussions, concerts, plays, and religious events. St. Paul preached here too. The wonderful Ephesus Museum in Selçuk is loaded with artifacts from Ephesus. The highlights for us were the marble statues of Artemis, whose rows of egg-like breasts symbolize fertility. The Temple of Artemis is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but you wouldn't know it by looking at the one remaining column of the original 133. Here's what it looked like 2,500 years ago. St. St. John's Basilica was built in the 5th century in honor of St. John, who came to this area with Mary after the death of Christ. The basilica was marble and shaped like a cross. It was one of the most sacred places in the Middle Ages. St. John is buried here. Invading Mongols destroyed the basilica in 1402. Pamukkale, a 5-hour bus ride from Ephesus, was our next stop. Pamukkale means cotton castle in Turkish, and you can see why. The entire hillside facing the town is covered in gleaming white calcium deposits that look like they're dripping down the slope. We removed our shoes as required and walked up 250 meters of calcium on our tender feet. The mineral bath, our sacred pool as it used to be called, is at the top of the hill. This was a spa city during Roman times. The sacred pool was once at the center of the city of Hierapolis, a popular spa city during Roman times. Cleopatra came here often. Hierapolis stands out among the ancient cities because it was built out of locally quarried stone instead of marble. Unlike other ancient cities, the buildings were not demolished for the marble. Hierapolis has a wonderful Roman theater, which is by far the best preserved theater in Turkey and probably Greece and Italy as well. Most of the stage was still standing along with a few statues somewhat intact. Hierapolis is noted for its necropolis, or cemetery, which is filled with sarcophaguses, or is it sarcophagi? After Hierapolis, we still didn't have our fill of ancient cities, so we decided to go to Aphrodisias, about 2 hours away. Aphrodisias was our favorite ancient city in Turkey. Only a handful of tour buses find their way to this isolated and beautiful city. Aphrodisias dates back over 7,000 years. By the 3rd century AD, it had become the capital of the Roman province. The theater, with a seating capacity of 7,000 people, was used for both dramatic performances and public assemblies. The bath, next to the theater, was an important center of public life where the citizens went to bathe, relax, and be entertained. The stadium of Aphrodisias was immense, with space for 30,000 people. It was built in the 1st century AD and used for athletic contests, gladiator combats, and wild beast fights. Inscriptions carved on the seats designated the reserved seating for groups such as the tanners and the goldsmiths, as well as for specific individuals. The council house, like the modern town hall, is where the city administrative council met. The Tetrapylon, a monumental gateway built in 200 AD, was painstakingly reconstructed out of the original marble pieces found at the site. Just imagine the processions that went through this gateway. An American archaeologist, Keenan Aram, who spent 3 decades studying and reconstructing Aphrodisias, is buried here. Our next adventure was a trip to the spa and mud bath with 2 Australian girls and some guys who worked at our hotel. The spa was in a 1950s-style motel. We were the only guest. Bill didn't go into the mud, but for the 3 gals, it was quite an experience. From Pamukkale, we took a bus to Fethiye. It was raining, and at higher elevations, it was snowing. The weather was better when we got to Fethiye on the Mediterranean coast. The next day, we took an excursion to the ghost city of Kayakoi. Kayakoi had been a thriving town for hundreds of years, but the residents, mostly Greek Orthodox, were expelled in 1924, and now the town is deserted. The Turkish authorities sent the residents to Greece after Turkey won its independence. In exchange, Turkish Muslims living in Greece were sent back to Turkey. About 250,000 Turks were involved. It was devastating for both the Greeks and the Turks. They were forced to leave the country of their birth and ancestors' home and make a new life in a foreign place. I was struck by a sign posted on a decaying building that said, "Goodbye to 600 years of peacefully living together." The village of Kayakoi was never reoccupied after the Greeks left, even though the town had many houses and churches. Today, people still have the deeds to their grandfathers' houses in Kayakoi, and when the EU membership becomes final, perhaps they will reclaim these properties. In the meantime, Kayakoi remains empty. We hiked from Kayakoi over a ridge to the Mediterranean beach at Uludeniz, considered to be one of the most beautiful beaches in Turkey. The 5-mile trail was partly on the ancient Lyceum Way. As we descended to the resort town of Uludeniz, we saw the big, wide, beautiful empty beach with paragliders overhead. The Saklıkent Gorge, about an hour-and-a-half drive from Fethiye, was our next destination. We took a dolmus, a minivan. Dolmus means stuffed in Turkish, and the minivans don't leave until they're stuffed with passengers. We entered the gorge near a large waterfall and walked upstream in icy knee-deep water rushing fast enough to knock you over. We walked slowly against the current, hoping our tevas would hold. We hiked deep into this amazing canyon as it got narrower and the current got stronger. At times, the span of the canyon walls was only an arm's length apart, with huge boulders wedged directly overhead. About a mile down the gorge, we came to a waterfall. We couldn't go any further without getting soaked, so we turned back. It was a grand adventure. On our last day in Fethiye, we decided to go on the famous 12-island Mediterranean cruise. As we sailed out of Fethiye harbor, we had good views of the city and the fancy yachts. We stopped a few times to swim and snorkel. We also hiked on some of the islands. They served us a very good lunch. The boat ride was relaxing, probably a little too relaxing for Bill and me, but we enjoyed seeing why this is called the Turquoise Coast. Early the next morning, we took the bus to the tiny town of Şarali. The scenery along the windy road on the Mediterranean coast was spectacular. Şarali is a rural village located on a beautiful Mediterranean beach. The ancient city of Olympos is within a few minutes' walk of Şarali. Olympos, named after the sacred mountain of the god Olympos, was once a prosperous port city. Now it's an overgrown jungle with temples, burial grounds, aqueducts, and a theater. We stopped for lunch at the little town of Olympos. We watched two kerchiefed women make gazlimis, a Turkish pancake that is similar to a burrito. It's made with thin dough and filled with your choice of meats, cheese, potatoes, onions, peppers, or spinach. On our way back to our hotel, we stopped at a glassblower shop to buy some souvenirs. That evening, Shaban, owner of our hotel, drove us to the Chimera, a cluster of flames that burn spontaneously from the crevices on the rocky hillside. Methane gas comes whooshing out from deep inside the mountain and fuels the flames. The Turks speculate that this is the source of the Olympic flame. Whatever, it was a pretty amazing sight. The next day, we went on a hike with Shaban, the owner of the hotel. We hiked in the hills where Shaban used to herd the family goats. We hiked for 8 miles past streams and waterfalls, beautiful wildflowers, over a ridge, and back to the Chimera where we had been the night before. It was interesting to see the fires during the daylight. After an enjoyable stay in Şarali, we were sad to leave, but it was time to move on to Antalya, the launching point for several adventures. Our first stop was Perga, originally founded around 5000 BC. The Greeks took over Perga after the Trojan War, but most of the ruins are from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The well-preserved Roman baths were impressive. We saw the ancient market where there had been 54 stalls arranged in a square with a temple in the middle. The stadium is huge with 69 entrances. During Roman times it was used for athletic events, but later it was a venue for gladiator combat and where Christians were thrown to the lions. Our next stop was the incredible Roman aqueducts. The Romans designed the aqueducts to slope so gravity would create a continuous flow. From the aqueducts, we headed for Aspendos, one of the best preserved Roman theaters in Turkey. This 2,000-year-old theater is still used for ballet and opera performances during the summer. They were setting up the stage for a ballet when we were there. After Aspendos, we went to a little farming village to get a taste of the rural life in Turkey. Next, we were led, like lambs to the slaughter, to the local carpet weaving center. A pudgy guy told us about the carpet weaving process. Cotton, silk, wool, knots per inch. Then the sales show began. In spite of their very professional sales pitch, we left without buying anything. The last stop of the day was at the beautiful Dudan waterfall and picnic area set within a Turkish national park. After an overnight bus ride, we arrived in Goreme, a little village in Cappadocia. Much of Cappadocia has weird moonscape topography formed from volcanic rocks. It is called the Valley of the Fairy Chimneys. People have been carving homes, hotels, churches, and shops out of the soft rocks for thousands of years. The main attraction in Goreme is the Open Air Museum, a valley loaded with churches carved from the soft rock. On the way to the Open Air Museum, we hiked along a ridge overlooking the main road to get a bird's eye view of the museum. The structures in the Open Air Museum were originally a part of a center for religious education. In the 4th century, St. Basil the Great, disillusioned with how materialistic the church had become, moved to Cappadocia and started a monastery. The caves provided protection from the harsh weather and from enemies. The Spartan cave environment also reflected St. Basil's dedication to poverty, obedience, and religious devotion. The complex includes churches, stables, kitchens, dining rooms, chapels, and burial places. The simple entrances to the cave open up to columns and arches carved from the rock. Some of the churches had elaborately painted frescoes and some had primitive symbols. Cappadocia is known as one of the best places in the world for ballooning because of its incredible landscape. We ascended to get a good overview of the terrain, then descended into the deep canyons to get a close-up view of the rock formations. We were so low that the bottom of the balloon's basket scraped the tops of trees. I loved floating among the balloon traffic jam in the sky. It was a dreamlike experience. As we descended for our landing, we watched the vans with trailers circling around the roads below, trying to anticipate where we would touch down. After our aerial experience in the balloon, we descended into an ancient underground city, one of over 200 underground cities in Cappadocia. No one is certain who began digging the underground cities, but some archaeologists think they might go back 3,000 to 4,000 years. Early Christians sought shelter from the Roman soldiers, and in the 6th century, the cities provided shelter from invading Arabs. The underground cities looked like ant farms going down many levels. We hiked through the beautiful Ilara Valley with a wide rushing river lined with graceful trees and farmland. The hike was made even more interesting because of the many ancient churches carved in the cliffs overhead. After lunch, we drove to the Saleme Monastery. We climbed up the side of a steep hill and walked around the ancient monastery. 300 to 400 monks once lived here, looking for enlightenment through a simpler life. Our next stop was the village of Gazelyard. We climbed a hill to get a peek at the Church of St. Gregory, built in 1896. Our last stop that day was Nar Lake, a volcanic crater whose green color comes from the reflection of the surrounding green landscape. The next day, we went to Avanos, a town famous for its pottery. Although they assigned a herd of salesmen to us, we didn't buy anything. Our next adventure was an hour-and-a-half hike through the Red and Rose valleys. The steep trail going down into the valley was a bit treacherous. We hiked past farmland and orchards and through caves. We gazed up at the churches, pigeon houses, and doorways carved into the porous rocks on the steep cliffs. Our last evening in Cappadocia, we went to see the whirling dervishes at a beautiful 12th century caravanserai. A 5-hour bus ride took us to Ankara, the capital of Turkey. Our first stop was the Citadel, the original part of Ankara, dating back 3,000 years. It was an interesting castle. People still live in the old Citadel. Our last adventure in Turkey was a visit to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's mausoleum. Ataturk is the father of modern Turkey. He led Turkey's struggle for independence after World War I. As we arrived, we were treated to a changing of the guard ceremony. The mausoleum was packed with Turks in awe of their version of George Washington. We were treated to a beautiful sunset on our last evening in Turkey. We were sad to say goodbye to this wonderful country.